Welcome, everyone. This is Jeff Carter with Seattle City Club. I want to welcome you to the Civic Bootcamp on Racial Equity and Systemic Racism. Before we begin, I'd like to let you know that Seattle City Club is a small nonprofit with a big mission to strengthen our community through conversations with community leaders on critical issues like this one, and encourage civic engagement. So please consider supporting us to continue programs like these by making a donation on our website, seattlecityclub.org. We will have chat enabled on the side of your screen. So if you have any questions for the panelists, please put them there. And I will route them to Marcus as we go along. If you have any technical issues, please go to CityClub at seattlecityclub.org. So cityclub at seattlecityclub.org. And finally, we at Seattle City Club value a healthy dialogue and debate and want to provide a safe and welcoming space for all to contribute. So in order to do this, we have established community standards for webinar communication, and we will not tolerate threats of violence, profanity, or any kind of hate speech. Those who violate our standards will lose the privilege of attending this webinar. So just to be clear. So with that being said, I'm really pleased to partner with Marcus Harrison Green, editor of the South Seattle Emerald, who will moderate this discussion. And thank you, Marcus, and I'll let you take it from here.
All right, thank you, Jeff. It's an honor to be here today, and thank you to everybody who is on this meeting here today. It gives me great pleasure now to introduce our esteemed panel, and I will start by introducing Sean Goode. He is the Executive Director at Choose 180. We then have Gardheere. She is the Equity Strategies Manager for the City of Seattle. And last, but certainly not least, we have Dr. Daudi. He is the author and a faculty member at Seattle Central College. Well, welcome to all three of you. Thank you so very much for being here. We are going to go ahead and get right into it with our first question. And that question is, in your opinion, what are the key issues in Seattle regarding systemic racism? And Dr. Daudi Dr. Ave, may I start with you, sir?
There we go. Sure, it's also my pleasure to be here amongst you all today. I'd say key issues. This is just kind of coming from a personal standpoint. I'd say have to revolve around education and law enforcement, two institutions that we know very well that have had less than stellar outcomes for marginalized, disenfranchised, and people of color. I think that contemporarily speaking, both of those institutions, Seattle Police Department and Seattle Public Schools, have received scrutiny from the federal government over the last several years, kind of specifically related to, at least surely in Seattle Public Schools case, related to the disproportionate discipline of African-American students, among other things. And I think that I focus in at least on those two occupations because they represent gatekeeper jobs, gatekeeper positions, in that the way in which they do their jobs can have significant effects on the life chances of the people that they do their jobs with, or the people that they serve anyway. They're supposed to be serving, doing their jobs. The educational piece is a little bit more gradual and slow and really takes time to kind of depress those life chances, but the police part can be much more immediate, not only just in terms of, incarceration, consequences including incarceration, but, expanding to the whole thing about, perhaps injury and perhaps even death. And so those two, at least for me, those two areas are really kind of key issues in terms of, again, for me, about the effects that they can have, particularly on the lives of young people and young people of color around the area. So for me, those are the areas that I focus on.
Okay, thank you for that. Sean, do you have anything to add on that one?
I mean, it's kind of like cheating, right? Like the brother just took the top two, and you're like, okay, you know, it's kind of like when you're sitting in class and the teacher asks a question, and then you got the students like, pick me, and they give like the best answers, and then you're like, okay, what about you? Well, what he said. Now, do I get credit too? No. You know, what I'll add to it, Brother Marcus, is that I think, you know, we live in the bastion of faux progressives who have mastered the semantics of diversity and inclusion, but lack an application of the very language that they know how to speak so fluently. And I think in our cavalier nature of owning the language, we think that we like somehow get it, right? And so I can talk about it really with great skill and finesse my way through it, but you don't live any different as a result of the language you own. I kind of, what I liken it to is sort of like getting ready for a vacation and like learning the basic language of the place that you're going to travel to. And the folks who know that language natively hear you speak and they know that you're a tourist, right? There is no misgivings because the accent, the dialect, some of the nuances that you regularly would have if you're indigenous to that space are missing. You may know how to order water or say thank you or please or hello, but you actually don't know how to engage in authentic conversation with people who are there in a way where it's where it feels like family, where it feels like actual community and like you're actually in a neighborhood. And I feel like Seattle in particular is an example of that, because people really do know the language of diversity and inclusion, and they can walk in and out of boardrooms or meeting spaces or classrooms and speak it with great eloquence, and then walk right out of those spaces and begin to live a life that doesn't manifest anything that's parallel to the language that they know. So for me, I'd say that's the only contribution I can give after my brother took the top two that I wrote down on the pre-questions on my post-it over here. So there's that.
Well, it was certainly a valued contribution nonetheless.
Hey, that was way better than mine.
All right. Well, Ube, do you have anything to add to that as well?
Yeah, I want to add that I work for the city and work for the Department of Planning and Community Development, and I believe that after the police department, the planning department has caused the most harm, and agree with what the gentleman said around systemic racism. I think for me, the way I look at it is one of the defining features of our region, you know, from colonial activities that resulted in massive death and displacement of the Duwamish and Coast Salish people, to the impacts of redlining, Japanese internment, anti-Chinese riots, and the ways that our cities and communities have developed have ties both explicitly and subtly to how white people have benefited from policies while holding back resources from BIPOC communities. I also want to add that the current patterns of development, gentrification, and displacement are really just the continuation of these patterns, right? And where the racialized wealth gap created by previous policies are then deployed to transfer land from communities of color to predominantly white buyers as soon as those properties are deemed desirable. It's what we're seeing in Central area right now, right? And because so much of the investments and structures of investment in community development don't explicitly address the history that I talked about, well-intentioned investments often serve to exacerbate the problem that they're supposedly intended to solve, whether it's housing development, whether it's transit infrastructure, whether it's economic development or the green use spaces. And also agree with the gentleman around, it's also important to remember that systemic and institutional racism are different and complementary structures, right? This region understands the language of systemic racism, but frequently uses the big picture to discuss and draw attentions away from the impact that institutional decisions have continued to be harmful to BIPOC communities. That's what I wanted to add.
Well, thank you for adding that. So with my next question, and you all basically touched on it, with the fact that here in Seattle, we do have sort of this mastery of language around diversity and inclusion, if not necessarily the actions all the times around it. And so I wanted to ask, with sort of this collective awakening, racial awakening and reckoning that we're doing nationally, how has all of these protests and so forth, how has that, you feel, influenced our own racial reckoning here in Seattle? I mean, I know that we're supposedly a liberal utopia. I've even heard some people call us an anarchist jurisdiction. But in terms of how things actually look here, what needs to happen with our racial reckoning here, and how can it actually happen and move beyond words and into actual actions and deeds? And I'll since Sean was in his feelings about not going first last time, I will start with Sean.
Thank you for, before everybody got on, I was sharing about my childhood trauma of having birthday parties and nobody show up. And so we were talking about being worried about nobody coming to this and me feeling like a particular way. And so Marcus is playing into my clearly some of the things that are lingering from my childhood. Thank you, Marcus, for playing into that. Here's the thing, right? Before George Floyd died, there were many people whose lives were taken by Seattle Police Department in equally as egregious ways. And we didn't awake from that. And even now, when our local politicians talk about the awakening, they reference murders, state sanctioned, in places outside of the city of Seattle. I mean, and so I think in its base, like, that is deeply problematic, that we're still externalizing something that is happening elsewhere as a motivating factor to talk about what's happening here, and not recognizing that it's happening here and it's a continuation of a conversation that we've been having and we need to continue to have, and it needs to extend beyond a moment. One of the things that it has afforded us in these multiplying pandemics is that there's enough of a pause for us to really get quiet enough to hear the cries from people who have been crying out the whole entire time. And so now there's a broader section of community that's leaning in and wanting to do something, but not quite sure what that something is. And I'm grateful for that. And simultaneously, for folks that have been doing the work, we were already knee deep in navigating these waters of systemic racism. And then all of this enthusiasm came and the waters began to rise, and now we're shoulder deep, head deep, swimming and gasping for air, because the expectation is we are continuing to lead this thing forward as people of color, Black folks in community. And so it's exciting to know that there's so many allies and advocates and folks that want to come alongside and push this thing forward and see systemic change. And it's also complicated because folks don't necessarily know how to fit in. And when they don't know how to fit in, they ask questions of the people who have already been there. And then it becomes an additional weight on us to find roles for people in this movement, when in reality, what would be best is to just sit back behind and push. What I think about, and I'll say this and then I'll stop talking because I'm not the only person on this panel, and there's so much more to share. What I think about it sometimes is, when your car dies and there has to be somebody steering the car and then there has to be somebody pushing the car, right? Like, to get it to where it needs to go. I feel like in Seattle, everybody wants to be behind the wheel. And nobody, and let me change that. I feel like white folks want to be behind the wheel, and they don't want to push the car, right? And so when you say, no, what we need you to do is push the car, they're like, but I can do so much more than push the car, right? I have so many more skills and talents. And we're like, no. Because the minute that you want to steer the car, it's centered again on whiteness and not on Blackness. So we need to steer the car. And what we need to do is have you push the car with your positional power, push the car with your accumulation of resources, push the car with your privilege, and we'll dictate where it goes. Just trust that when we get there, it'll be a place centered in our experience and not your expectations. And I think that is where I find myself in the midst of this moment that we're in.
All right. Thank you for that, brother. So Ube, I would ask the same question to you. How are we dealing with that racial reckoning here in Seattle?
Yeah, so I want to agree with Sean, and then also start with these police killings has been happening, and for it's, for me, I think it's like, right now it's being recorded, right? It's something that's been happening. It's what I look and see as a kind of a modern day lynching. And I think in Seattle, what's happening is, especially somebody that, works for government, agree with Sean that there's just a lot of drivers but not like doers, to undo institutional racism, to make investment where they're supposed to go, to, like really do our internal. For me, I think I'm an organizer, so inside outside game is really important. And the organizers out there are doing the work and the pressure and the advocacy. But internally, what are we doing to organize for change is like what I think about a lot. And honestly, I don't think that right now as government, we are walking the talk, And I think listening to the people most impacted by this should be where we should start, right? And then help what Sean said. I loved his metaphor, like you really push that car and let the Black indigenous communities, especially the Black community, African-American community who has been impacted by this, do the driving, as we are like supporting and making the investments that really need to happen in order to push for that. A lot of time I talk about this from a development perspective, right? And I look at like in the 60s when the white flight was happening, and 98% of the FHA loans and investments went to white buyers in the suburbs. We really were not questioning, right? That we were actually facilitating as government, as banks, as real estate and folks. We were really facilitating that. And then now that we are in a place where we see how systemic racism is playing out, all of a sudden we actually use the same laws to discriminate against the folks we are supposed to be investing in. So that's what I want to add to that. I think Seattle, again, walks the talk, but when it comes to making investments, when it comes to really doing the needed institutional change that will lead to racial equity outcomes, I think that's when we like start looking around and say, you're supposed to do that, you're supposed to do that, you were supposed to do that, or just go out in front of it, in some other ways and try to really facilitate and operationalize solutions that hasn't come from those impacted communities. So that's what I want to add to that question.
Thank you very much. Dr. Abe, same question to you. How are we dealing with this racial reckoning here in Seattle?
Well, I feel like the environment around here is framed by local history, and the idea that this is a progressive place didn't come out of nowhere, although it has led to what really feels like a very self-congratulatory attitude about how far this place is. You know what I'm saying? I get people all the time and having these discussions about, well, at least we ain't Alabama. And I'm like, come on, yo, that's a low bar. You know what I mean? If that's what we're going for, you're going to say that's what we got to be thankful for. Okay, well, okay. I'm not gonna be lazy like that. But I think that, so I'm just saying, like, historically speaking, like Washington entered the Union with a strict, no segregated schools written into the Constitution. In the 1880s, Black men and for a time Black women voted in the Washington territory. And you have like it's a little both ways, but the story of Barry Lawson from 1938, who was a Black man, 27-year-old Black man that worked in the Mount Fuji Hotel. The building is still down there on Yesler. As a waiter in the hotel, was seen by couple white police officers asleep in the lobby in a chair. The white officers contacted him. An hour and a half later, Barry Lawson is dead in the hospital with a fractured skull. And the officer said, well, we made contact with him and he broke loose and he flung himself down a flight of stairs, and that's what happened. So what I'm saying, Black community wasn't going for that. Anyway, after a series of protests, those officers were suspended and fired, then brought up on charges and convicted, sentenced to 20 years apiece in 1938. Now, the governor, a couple of months in, actually commuted those sentences, and those officers walked free. So justice was not ultimately served. But I'm just saying the fact that it even got that far, that officers went to jail in 1938, unbelievable. I have a hard time seeing that happen now, much less 80 some years ago. And then, but you also have kind of the reality of the situation, which, like I mentioned earlier, are the federal oversight for the Seattle Police Department and Seattle Public Schools related to how they're treating and what their interactions are like with Black folks. And then, something like, I teach a hip hop course at Seattle Central, and one of the units that we do is about the 80s crack epidemic and how kind of hip hop, interpreted what was happening, on the street for the mainstream and that kind of thing. And one of the things that we do is kind of go back and talk about the sentencing laws and how criminal justice system was approaching that. Not only did you have the 100-to-1 rule, which, nationally meant that if you had 5 grams of crack, you would receive the same amount of prison time as someone who had 500 grams of powder. You know what I mean? More time for less drugs. And then locally, you had the King County Prosecutor's Office during that time. When they would arrest somebody that had crack on them, would almost always go for possession with intent to distribute, whether that person was an addict or not, because the intent to distribute charge added years onto the sentence. And so I'm just saying that there is a bunch of kind of it's back and forth. You know what I mean? You have this reputation, which I'm not saying is undeserved completely. It's certainly different. I mean, look at Oregon. I mean, it's just places like, comparatively speaking to Oregon, but also, like I said, that everybody, so many people want to pat themselves on the back. And I'm not just talking about white people. I'm talking about, there's a lot of people of all colors who feel that way. And I feel like the pushback on that is, yes, there are some good things, but also these other things that speak to the larger issues of systemic racism around these particular things those particular institutions that I mentioned earlier.
Well, Dr. Abe, I actually want to stick with you a minute, because I know there's a recent story that was produced in the Seattle Times that said that it was roughly, I think, 53% of people who live in Seattle are not even from Seattle. And so knowing that there is this history here, this history of structural and systemic racism, can you talk a little bit more about the root causes of the racism that the impacts of the racism that we see here today? I mean, you look at a place like the Central District, who, when I grew up here, I want to say it was around 70% of people were Black in that district. Now it's less, it's not even in the double digits at this point, from, I believe, the last census that was taken. And so can you talk a little bit more about, that the history of racism here and how that impacts us now here today? And also, I would love to audit your class sometime if you are accepting folks.
My door's always open. It's interesting because, in the 1870s, I want to say, 1860s, a man named William Gross came to Seattle. He was the second Black resident, and he had a hotel and a barbershop down on the waterfront. And when that burnt down in the Seattle fire, I want to say of 1887. Anyway, he relocated to a place right up close to here on near 23rd and Madison. And so this becomes kind of the early spot of settlement for Black middle class people in the city. And so the Central District grows, but at the same time, Black people who move here, that move into this neighborhood, are kind of confined because of redlining and the refusal, of real estate agents and the absence of an open housing policy. And so once the open housing policy is passed in 1968, which is like a couple weeks after Martin Luther King is assassinated, that allows Black people, to start moving out of the Central District into other neighborhoods that they had not been allowed to move into before. But it also allowed Black people who were coming in from out of town that may not have had necessarily any connection to the local Black community to be moving into places outside of the Central District. So the kind of the I don't want to use anything as dramatic as to call it a diaspora, but it's kind of similar in terms of like Central people, kids who grew up in the Central District and now are kind of scattered throughout, kind of being pushed steadily south into areas like Renton and Federal Way, Kent and Auburn. So I think that there's a little kind of mini diaspora of African Americans who started off kind of growing up in the CD as their neighborhood of origins and have now kind of spread gradually throughout mainly in the southerly direction through the suburbs that exist down there.
Right. Thank you for that. Now, Uwe, I wanted to move to you real quickly, because I know that you had talked earlier about the impacts of some of the issues that some of the issues in terms of funding and so forth, and when it came from various loans for housing and the like, that has impacted the community development here in Seattle, and has disproportionately affected the Black community. Could you talk a little bit more about that?
Yes. So I could probably also start with a little bit of a context around the Equitable Development Initiative, which is the program that I am working on with the City of Seattle, and has the dual purpose of mitigating displacement and increasing access to opportunity while building on local cultural assets of those communities, right? And we have seen, as people are coming back to the urban core. We are seeing that the jobs are in downtown Seattle and areas like that. The impact that we're seeing is displacement of Black communities, immigrant and refugee communities. Even with, if we look at in Chinatown and areas like that, we're seeing displacement of small businesses in Chinatown and things like that. Dr. Abe shared the statistics around redlining happened, and the African American community was able to put together a community or a village, where in central areas, that's where they had everything. They had their barber shop, they had the churches, they had their kind of culturally specific and groceries and things like that. And then as displacement has started happening to these communities, especially the Black communities in central area, we're seeing residential displacement happening, and people being actually pushed further and further in South King County, or even Pierce County, but the churches that African Americans have built in central area are still there. It's buildings, right? But we see that the folks who used to pray in those churches also have been displaced. So one of the impacts that we're seeing there, it's we're seeing kind of land rich but cash poor and community right now, as displacement has happened. So the kind of investments that can take care of that is, again, investing in those in communities that own these churches and this land, to build a culturally appropriate and responsive village, quote unquote. I keep using the word village, right? That, I think the other impacts that we're seeing both in central area and then Rainier Beach, Othello, where folks have been displaced to, is Seattle's the whitest city in the nation, if we're being real, right? It's I think the last time I checked the data, it was about the fourth and whitest city in the nation. Other impacts that I wanted to bring up that, as far as history is concerned, between 1960s and 1990s, Dr. Abe talked about the open housing ordinance, but we see in these neighborhoods also the freeway revolt. We see segregated schools, we hear a lot of people talking about separate but equal, but that was not playing in reality. That's not what was happening in these neighborhoods. We also see actually around that time where the light rail was rejected by Seattle, and Atlanta ended up getting that infrastructure. The other piece around between 1990 and now, actually, we see kind of the introduction of the growth management, and also, gentrification happening in these neighborhoods. Obviously, the tech boom and bust, right? That Africa Town Land Trust right now is working on kind of figuring out innovation center where, Black youth have access to technology. You know, like you said that 53% of the residents in Seattle are not from Seattle, but where are they from? Where are these tech companies, you know, getting and the employees that are getting over $100,000 a year to do software and engineering and things like that? Those are the questions that we really need to ask ourselves. And how are we making sure that, you know, the youth that are growing up here from here have access to this kind of jobs? You know, another thing that I want to like actually mention is around, especially right now, we are in a like 8 months of, you know, COVID impacts and other, you know, other impacts that the gentleman had mentioned. But, you know, what we saw after the recession is an even recovery that disproportionately, again, impacted the Black community, the Indigenous community, and other people of color. You know, nationally right now, and 42% of Black-owned businesses have gone out of business, you know, and that, again, like I said earlier, is kind of, you know, contributing to the wealth gap that we are seeing right now. The other thing is, like, wanted to talk about is around, you know, we're seeing segregation, and a lot of times the argument we use around segregation is like it's an unintended consequence, you know, like that's what happens when, you know, we grow as a city or as a community. But other things we hear is around individual choices. So I just want to make sure that I'm mentioning that it's not that. It's like law and investments that were facilitated by, you know, government, by banks, and actually public policy that explicitly segregated all the metropolitan areas in the United States, including in central area. I don't know where I'm going with that. I think I forgot the question. I just went on and on. So stop me and let me know if I answered that question. I can go back.
No, you provided a lot there, and we very much appreciate it. So it was you were comprehensive and rich in your answer. So richly detailed in your answer. So, but I do want to turn now to our criminal justice system. We know that structural racism certainly manifests itself in a very pronounced way in our criminal justice. Some people call it the criminal punishment system. And I know, Sean, that over at Choose 180, you deal a lot with the impacts of the criminal justice system on our youth. Can you talk a little bit about your work and how the criminal justice system continues to impact the youth here in our community?
Yeah. Let me start off by saying my wife and I, we bought our home about 7-8 years ago, and there was a cherry tree in the backyard. Now, somebody planted it long before we got there, but you know what? It still produces cherries. Now, it doesn't produce as many cherries as it used to as it's gotten older, and there's so many branches that are dying off on this particular tree, but it's still a cherry tree. And I actually find that to be true with anything that's planted, that, you know, that what was at the beginning is in turn what it still is today. It may look different because of how big it's grown and what extends from its branches, but it still is what it has always been. And policing in this country is and has always been a method of controlling Black bodies, policing Black bodies, and prohibiting Black bodies from experiencing the liberties and freedoms entitled to them by their birthright. And so, you know, whether we talk about its beginnings in slave catching in the South, or we talk about the use of it in the North to be able to restrict Black bodies to certain spaces, or how even when they integrated police forces in the North, they would only allow Black police officers to police Black neighborhoods, but wouldn't allow Black police officers to police white neighborhoods. And it's clear that the system of policing from its beginning was rooted in racism and the intent to harm Black bodies. Now, saying that doesn't mean that people who don that uniform are bad people. What it does mean is that people who put on that uniform are putting on a uniform that carries with it years and years and years of generational trauma that's been passed on. that's been internalized by people who have been harmed by people who wear that particular uniform. And so in the greater context of things, we can't have a conversation about systemic racism and the impact on the justice system without understanding the historical trauma embodied inside of Black people that causes us to shrink up and become afraid whenever a police officer is in our rearview mirror, or driving next to us when we're standing on a street corner, or finding ourselves doing the most basic and humane things. It still causes a fight or flight mechanism in many of us. I drive a red Prius, which means I can't even hardly speed. But the fact is that if a police officer pulls up behind me, I still clench up and I still get nervous. And I still begin to check my rearview mirror every few seconds. I make intentional movements. I'm looking at them like they're watching me intently, and they may not even be doing that. But because my father came from Richmond, Virginia, and his father was on a plantation as a sharecropper, and it is embedded in my DNA, this years of trauma, and our young people have this same trauma embedded in them. And so it's impossible to be able to tell them that policing is an avenue for public safety because they don't feel safe around police, which then in turn creates dynamic. When police are present in Black communities, it causes more harm than good, even if you employ people who are from the community to don that uniform, because the uniform in and of itself is a triggering and traumatic experience. And so here we are in the city of Seattle having a very intentional conversation around defunding police. And one of the things I say, Marcus, I'm gonna get to your question, but I need to be able to couch the question in this larger conversation around how our resources are spent. And so we're in this time where we have this conversation around defunding police. And what I'm asking people regularly, especially my white friends, is throughout the history of your life, how often have you engaged police? And most often my white friends tell me maybe once, maybe twice, probably not at all, which seems like a really poor return on your investment. That if you're spending tax dollars on a service that you're not benefiting from, then why are you so insistent on how those tax dollars should be spent on that particular service? So who is actually engaging law enforcement, and at what frequency? Well, no matter how small we shrink the numbers of young people who are being detained in cages at the Alder building, the disproportionality has remained the same. So there may only be a daily count of 15 young people downstairs in this building that costs hundreds of millions of dollars. The majority of them are Black and brown young people. And even as we've come up with other methods of incarcerating young people in community, like through electronic home monitoring, still a disproportionate amount of the young people are Black and brown young people who are on electronic home monitoring. Now, in Seattle and in King County, it's only 8% Black, only 8%. That means I could statistically go my whole entire day and not see another Black person based upon the numbers of Black people who are in our community. Then how is it that the vast majority of the young people who are incarcerated are reflective of the smallest population of people who live in our community? Well, it's because the neighborhoods that our young people are relegated to live in because of the economic disparities are overly policed. And so things that are simply adolescent behavior are then in turn criminalized instead of being treated as they would in other communities that don't have police present in the same way. Like young people getting in fights, always gonna happen, not gonna stop it. Young people stealing, always gonna happen, not gonna stop it. Young people doing drugs and alcohol, that's never gonna happen. It's gonna happen in every neighborhood, in every community across our state. The point being, in the South End, those behaviors are criminalized because that's where the police presence is emphasizing the need to be able to catch Black bodies doing things that are bad. And we have to get to a point where we're no longer criminalizing adolescent behavior. Let me give you a juxtaposition of this that we recently experienced inside of our cause. We recently had a group of young people get referred to us because they got caught swimming in a lake illegally. They weren't supposed to be in the park. Now, these kids lived in a neighborhood on the east side. Now, when we called their parents to tell them that they had the opportunity to participate in our programming, and in doing so, get their criminal charges dropped, these parents were mad that the behavior of their teens were being policed. And they thought it was ridiculous that swimming in a lake should have been something criminalized, even though they were trespassing. Meanwhile, in the South End, we have children who are giving out backpacks at a park, and police get called on them for an illegal assembly at a park in the South End. Now, riddle me this. Black kids giving out backpacks at a park get police called on them. And very little noise is made about it. White kids on the east side swimming in a lake, and their parents are in an uproar because police shouldn't be in our neighborhoods criminalizing the behavior of our young people. So we've internalized that there's a certain type of people who police are supposed to be criminalizing their behavior, and others that their behavior just needs to be adolescent. So as a result, we end up with vast disparities in the criminal punishment system where our young people, our Black and brown young people, don't get a chance to be young, don't get a chance to be kids, don't get a chance to fail forward like white kids do, and ultimately end up in the school to prison pipeline, if not incriminated by law enforcement, incriminated by their teachers and their principals through vastly archaic suspension and expulsion policies, which do more harm than good. And we know that to be true across the board. And this manifests itself in a bastion of progressiveness in Seattle, in the same place where we had people protesting against building a youth jail. And then when it gets built, we realize that there's only a handful of young people who are inside of the youth jail. And then our executive says, oh, well, we should close the building down and repurpose it by 2025. At some point, we should have listened to the people who were protesting to say we shouldn't do that at all. And I think at this moment, we should listen to the people who are saying we need to defund police by 50%, because what we're going to find in 5 to 7 to 10 years from now is that that was the right choice to make. It's just going to take so much longer if we rely on politicians and bureaucrats to make that move. But we as a people and our collective voice as taxpayers in the community, we can continue to make our voice heard and felt and say it is an imperative we return what we're resourcing law enforcement to the 2010 total of $200 and some odd million, and take that other $200 million and invest it directly in what the community says it needs. And the people who are being overly policed, I promise you, they're not asking for more police officers. They're asking for counselors who look and like and reflect the community. They're asking for people in the schools that actually can connect with the young people with shared experiential diversity. They're asking for teachers that look like them. They're asking to be able to go to a 4-year high school and get all the credits you need at that high school because that high school is funded well enough. Isn't that a novelty? These are things that we can do, but it's going to require our collective voice to make that happen. And using that collective voice is going to prove to the world whether or not we really are as progressive of a city, or we just really know the language really well so we can talk about what's going on.
Got you. Well, I know you talk about the collective voice, and now it seems like people's collective voice around making vows and pervasive proclamations about the fact that Black Lives Matter and a racial awakening, wanting to do better and so forth. But I know there has to be a little bit of deja vu in the sense that we've seen this before, right? There have been killings in the past, whether it's been Trayvon Martin, Sandra Bland, Eric Gardner, where there is some, seemingly a mass uprising and a mass awakening, and then it dies down again. And so I want to ask, how can we go beyond just, another moment where people get as soon as people get distracted again, there's an expiration date on empathy and just awareness around these issues? How do we actually go into action and stay, honestly, just stay woke, if you will, to what is going on within our society? And so, Dr. Abe, I want to put that question to you first, sir.
I think people have to, I'm not gonna say choose sides, but I mean, it's if you were gonna act like you didn't really know what was going on before, you can't really take that position now. And I'm talking about just in terms of racial discourse and dynamics around like like we were just talking about the criminal justice and law enforcement, and the fact that I was going back to the whole crack example, and how when that 100-to-1 rule was finally rectified, there was data that talked about how 20 African Americans made up 25% of crack users, yet accounted for 82% of crack convictions. That kind of disproportionate number, you know what I mean? And when I pose that question out to the people at the Criminal Justice Training Commission, sometimes it's a little bit of a struggle to kind of come up with what that means. But that kind of gets back to what Sean was talking about, the over policing and criminalization of, my explanation for that disparity is that they were going where they thought they were going to find it. And when you think you're going to go find something there as a police officer, often than not, you have the means at your disposal to find it, whether you actually really found it or not. And so yeah, I think that I don't want to say that law enforcement needs to lead in this way, because the one thing that I've learned out there is that the culture of law enforcement is not exactly excited to have these conversations. This is why I was talking about the gatekeeper professions, about up to this point, the training and what it takes to become a police officer has not engaged at all, as far as I'm aware, about how you feel about the ways in which you feel about race affect how you do your job. Out at the CJTC, people are out there you're out there for how long? So anywhere you're hired in the state, you go to this, but just out there past in Burien, you go out there for 5 months and you're on the street with a gun. You know what I mean? And nowhere in there is there really any built-in discussion about the overlap between the history of race and policing. You know what I mean? I don't know if having every cadet that goes through there is going to make a difference in terms of how they do their job once they hit the street, but I know that those conversations ain't really being had consistently now. We see what the situation is. So, I mean, it's not like it's going to be able to make it any worse. But I also want to get back to the idea of, having a diverse kind of workforce. And in my time working with trying to figure out how to implement this kind of curriculum, it's seemed clear that there's a difference anyway, as I see it, between diversity there and culture change. And so if I'm saying, what about diversity? What if you have, I remember hearing Chief Best talk about when the discussion about cutting the police force was front and center, about how this most recent cohort of new officers that they had is the most diverse that they've ever had. And that makes me think of the issue of diversity versus culture change, because you think about the Freddie Gray case in Baltimore, 3 of the 6 officers in that situation charged were Black. The police chief at the time was Black, and the mayor was Black. But so you had diversity there, but the culture of policing still took over in that Freddie Gray situation, and he ends up dead. Right. So you have this. So then, how about a situation like in Minneapolis? I wanted to know, so I actually asked. There was a workshop out there at the CJTC, and I was asking, kind of at the table, these people who are law enforcement veterans, what if after about 2.5 minutes, one of the 3 other officers on the scene that day when George Floyd died would have went over to dude who had his knee on his neck and been like, hey, okay, we got him. Let's get him in the car. The consensus answer at the table was that the officer who would have done that would have been immediately ostracized when they got back to the station house. And if you think about it, in a job where you may literally have to put your life in your partner's hands, a lack of trust can be a serious problem. And on top of that, the officer who said something that would have ended up saving George Floyd's life would have been like, okay, you know what I'm saying, you showed me up in public in front of people like that. And so the culture of law enforcement disincentivizes the policing or the ability or the willingness of some people to try and get correct, incorrect, and even criminal behavior. And so that's completely off the point, Marcus, of what you were asking. But I'm just saying that in terms of, I think it was Sean that made me think about just the idea of diversifying something versus the idea of really getting in the culture. Last thing, probably maybe within the last year or so, I saw a young man. He looked like a young man of color. He was a rookie Seattle police officer. He was being interviewed on one of the local channels about his experiences. And one of the things he said was he was surprised by was how much hate he was getting because of the uniform he was wearing. And I remember watching that and thinking, man, that is a complete failure on the part of the CJTC, because those conversations have to be having had before he even gets on the street. Why is he getting on the street and just now finding out that these feelings, like you're saying, Sean, it ain't like everybody that puts on the uniform is bad, but you better damn well have at least some sense of the history that is involved in that. You know what I'm saying? Because if to me, that can help you do your job better. And ultimately in a job like that, help make you safer, which is something that I think I hear police talking about all the time. So it's a little bit of a disconnect for me about the resistance to have these conversations, but the wanting of tools that you can have in your tool belt as a police officer to make you more effective and safer in your job.
Got it. All right, well, Uwe, how do we go beyond just proclamations and make sure that this moment doesn't expire without there being some sort of structural change?
That's a good question. I think for me, really focusing on the BIPOC community with real emphasis on Black and Indigenous people, having genuine authority to direct resources within their communities, and those resources at the scale where scarcity and division is not conquering, right? And then the other thing I want to add is, for me, using this, answering this question from the EDI perspective is, we are set up expressly to challenge traditional modes of community development, right? And for us, that means developing a program that at all times reckons with the impacts, again, of systemic and institutional racism that it has had on Black and Indigenous communities. And then I want to quote one of my colleagues who always describes EDI, or the Equitable Development Program, as an anti-racist program that works on real estate rather than a real estate program with an anti-racist lens. So how do we use that framework to guide, across the board, the work that we are doing is what is coming to me right now. And the distinction here is important because it allows us to reframe what the work is and how we also reframe potential solutions, right? For us, the goal is to heal and repair historic harms and inequities. It's easier for programs and strategies that operate in institutionally racist settings to try to go about equity as efficiently as possible, right? And instead of having a continuous and ongoing dialogue with impacted communities about the work and moving at the speed of trust and being willing to be human with each other as the work progresses. We're working and talking about human beings and how this is impacting the human beings, not buildings and things like that, right? The other thing I want to add here is ultimately there needs to be a conversation about reparations and what it takes to meaningfully reckon with our history and make amends, and really looking at, the Black community. And when I mean, I'm a Black woman, but I'm an immigrant and refugee, right? And Sean was talking about, kids being kids. I grew up in a homogeneous society where, everybody that I saw looked like me, sorry. The president looked like me, everybody looked like me. I'm like, and sometimes when I'm talking to people that I grew up with, we say if we grew up in this country, we would have actually ended up in prison, some of us, right? And then I look at my sons who are 14 years old and 10 years old, and they had to think about, their Blackness and how it's impacting them at the age of 5. So what I'm saying is, and when we're even thinking about reparations, when we're thinking about investments, we really need to think about who has been impacted, right? Who, in this country is built in the backs of Black slaves. Their lands were taken from them. So how are we making sure that we are putting together strategies that really is investing in these communities is what I've been thinking about a lot. So that's where I'm gonna leave with you as we are putting together strategies and things like that. We really need to think about who's gonna benefit, who's it gonna burden, and at the end of the day, who's paying for it.
Thank you very much for that. Sean, can I ask you, sir, how do we go into actual substantive changes as opposed to just words?
Yeah. Well, please, not just vote, but study your ballot, right? Please study your ballot. Read that book like your life depends on it, because our lives do. So please, please, please study your ballot and vote according to what would be best for Black people, Indigenous people, and people of color, with an emphasis on Black people, because when Black lives matter, then all lives matter. And when Black lives are supported, when you do for us, you do for all, as we have been those that have been most marginalized in this country. And this isn't an effort to play the oppression Olympics, it just is what it is. Now, in addition to that, like, the people who have tapped into this call today are likely those who are already intentionally engaging in these types of conversations. And it's also very likely that you sit at dinner tables or in community spaces with others that think that you're like the zealot of the group, or you're like the one that's always talking about the social justice stuff. And can we talk about something else? Can we just play a game of cards or watch TV that's non-consequential, right? Like, you're likely that person. And I would ask you to continue to be that person. Continue to be the spur that urges people to move forward and stay galvanized around the collective movement that's being built by Black brilliance throughout King County. The work of King County Equity Now is a function of multiple organizers, PhDs, artists, and a variety of gifted, brilliant Black people, Indigenous people, and people of color who are leading in this region an effort to keep this momentum going and see actual liberation for Black bodies in the King County region. You can be a part of that by tapping in, by connecting, and supporting the collective efforts of all of us that are part of that group. Some of you can't march, that's fine, but there's the everyday marchers, and they're out there every day, right? Engage with groups like that. But that's not all that's required. Convene groups with your friends, do book studies about being anti-racist. Once you do the book study, engage community-based organizations led by Black folks and begin to support their work to demonstrate your learning. Find ways to apply these things and realize that even when the smoke clears and the sun begins to shine, that it may seem like a new day for many, but it is the same day for Black, brown folks in this community. And we have been living this before George Floyd. And it is my heart and my passion that my son, who is almost 19, and my daughter, who is 13, that when I am holding their children and their children's children, that we will be living in a world that does not reflect the world that we live in today. But if we continue the trajectory of the past 50 to 60 years, we'll likely be watching a panel in a much more virtual setting with people having similar conversations. It doesn't have to be that way, though. We can be the generation that redeems the whole of humanity and actually allows for racial reconciliation to occur by leaning into the brilliance of Black folks, following the brilliant Black folks to a place of liberty for Blackness, which will then in turn be liberty for all. Thank you so much, Marcus, for the opportunity.
Thank you, Sean. I didn't know whether that was you or you were channeling President Obama, but it was very inspiring. That being said, I know that we have come extremely close to our finish line. I did want to, since we started with him, I did want to finish with you really quickly, Dr. Abe. I just had one quick question for you. We live in a very tumultuous and precarious time. That's probably an understatement. And I wanted to ask if you could just briefly say what gives you hope for the future here in the city.
What gives me hope? What gives me hope is my children and the children of my friends and the young people that I have taught at Zion Preparatory Academy in the 90s, and the young people that I've taught at Seattle Central and other places in the 2000s. You know, just using my daughter Layla as an example. She's 19 now, but I mean, even at 15, she was engaging in kind of critical race theory in a way that I was not up on until I was well into college. And the fact that she at that age was so, and friends around her and are having these kinds of conversations, these kinds of critical conversations at that age, is something that I really, really gives me hope. And as I see more young people who are willing to engage in ways that previous generations may not have, it definitely gives me hope. And I mean, look, I'm old enough to remember when the whole Rodney King thing went down, and that was my age when I was out there marching, and I was kind of in the mix of all that. And I look now, you know, at my old self, looking at these younger people, and just not only the size of the marches, but the demographics of the marches, and the young people kind of feeling drawn to this time and feeling a calling that this is a pivotal moment in history. It does get, the young people are what give me hope.
All right. Well, Dr. Abe, Ube, and Sean, just thank you so much for your brilliance, for your speaking here today. I know that people didn't pay anything for this, but I would have gladly have given my, my life savings to, well, okay, not that. I would have given a paycheck though to listen to you all. This was wonderful, truly wonderful, and I was honored to be your moderator today.
May I work in a shameless plug, please?
Shame away.
Shame away. Emerald Street: A History of Hip Hop in Seattle, published by University of Washington Press, coming on November 15th. Forward by Sir Mix-a-Lot.
And I just ordered it, and you can pre-order it. So if you go online, the University of Washington Press has it all ready for you. You can get it hot off the presses.
Damn, that was even more shameless than me. Thank you.
Marcus, I just realized I need to start bringing a hype person to these panels with me.
I'm taking notes.
I see how you finesse that.
I'm taking notes myself. Taking notes myself. Well, with that though, we will turn it back over to Jeff. So thank you all again.
Thank you, Marcus, and thank you to all the speakers. Really appreciate it. What a great conversation we had today. And please join us next week, October 9th. We have another panel discussion, our second follow-up to this one, talking about, so now what can we do? Kind of a next step. And we have Nikita Oliver moderating with Rachel Stewart from Seattle Housing Authority, Jose Luis Rodriguez from the Station Coffee Shop, and Mariko Lockhart from the Seattle Office for Civil Rights. So please join us October 9th. And we want to make sure to thank our Civic Bootcamp supporting partner, Alaska Airlines, for helping us put these programs on. And again, if you'd like to make any donations to help us in supporting our efforts to get these programs to you, please go to seattlecityclub.org/donate. So with that, thank you all and have a great day and take care and stay safe.
All right.